Hi everyone, Brian here. It's been a long time since my last upload, and for that I can only apologise. 2023 didn't get off to the best start for me. To begin with, I had a leaking apartment, so I had to pack away all my miniatures and modelling equipment for several months. And then, unfortunately, I had a relative who had passed away after a long-term illness. Both of these, plus some new work responsibilities and the ever-increasing cost of living, meant that I just had to reprioritise my life for a little while. But I've recently had a short break back in Ireland and I'm feeling much more refreshed and relaxed, so I'm going to try and tackle my pile of shame. I wanted to do something different, so rather than just start straight back into Space Marines, I thought I would paint up my most recent delivery from Imperium magazine, Inquisitor Greyfax. I think this is a great looking model, and one that I've wanted to paint for a long time ever since I picked up the Magic the Gathering Commander deck. It's also a good opportunity to try and paint some gold in a nice, bright and ornate style, something which I've avoided whenever I paint my Sanguinary Guard. And it's also going to make good practice for when I finally get my hands on the new Commander Dante model. Hopefully this video will give you some ideas for painting gold, dark metallics and pale flesh on your own models, not just Inquisitor Greyfax. As always, I will include recipes and links to the paints and tools I use in the description below. And for full transparency, these are affiliate links, so Amazon will throw me a few pennies my way at no extra cost to you. Think of it as a nice free way of supporting my channel if you're in the market for some supplies. So before we jump into it, please consider giving the video a like or subscribing to the channel for future content. I do all these videos in my spare time, and while I don't have an awful lot of that right now, I really do appreciate your support and it gives me the drive to carry on. Right, with that out of the way, let's get started. I have my model here in a sub-assembly and primed with Vallejo polyurethane black primer. Just a quick note, if you do pin your model in a similar way as I have here, don't use too much super glue. I did, and it caused a real headache when it came time to remove the pins from the body and the head. In fact, I almost damaged the model in doing so please be careful. For the base layer, I'm going to airbrush the model with Scale 75 black metal. This is the Metal and Alchemy range from Scale 75, and it's really good in airbrushes when thinned. Now I initially thinned this down on a 1:1 basis with airbrush thinner, but I quickly realised it was far too thick whenever I tried to spray it, so I ended up thinning it down in a ratio of about 3:1. As you can see here, I'm testing out my airbrush in my glove. That's because I'm trying to find the right level of spray to apply to the model so that I don't go full blast and get a solid metallic effect. I start by spraying the model mostly in the upright position where the light would catch the armour. And I don't tilt the model upside down too much unless it's to do things like the back of the legs or the back of an arm. And when I do, I really need to make sure that I don't overspray. I want to leave some of that black primer visible to create shadows. I'm trying to make the primer and the base coat do all the hard work now, so that I've got minimal shading to do on these areas later on. Because she has a lot of gold trim, I thought this would help prevent the model from looking too gaudy, but also a little bit more interesting than black. I think if I was to use any other kind of silver metallic, that's what would happen, and this is the darkest that I can find. So as always, in between stages, I give my model a couple of coats of gloss varnish to protect it, and help make it easier to correct mistakes later on. Once that's cured, I start with the non-metallic base colours. I'm going to give the cloaks and the Purity wax seals a thin coat of GW Mephiston Red. Oh, and don't forget to paint the inner lining of the cloak near the chest. As for the bolter, it's just going to get a coat of GW Corn Red. The tunic, I'm going to give several coats of GW Wraithbone White. And the Purity seals get a thin coat of Rakarth Flesh. Now I also went ahead and painted in a few other details red, like the emblem on her gloves and hat, but this was just more of a reminder than anything else, and you can always do it at a later stage. I love this contrast of the red against the black metal, it just looks so good. With that done, it's time to move on to the gold trim. For this base coat, I decided to start with Scale 75 Elven Gold. Unlike Space Marines, I think Inquisitors should be quite bright and ornate, to symbolise their office and stature. I've thinned this down with just a brush full of water, so I'm going to apply 2 coats in order to get a solid base. In general though, this range of paints has great coverage and I highly recommend them. The hardest parts of this trim are the chest and the bottom of the corset. However, you don't have to worry too much about mistakes at this stage. Some, like this mistake here, are why I have a coat of gloss varnish. By taking a clean wet brush, I can simply rub away the mistake without damaging the base layer underneath. Others are easily corrected later on by an oil wash or a thin coat of the base colour, if necessary. So at this stage I also go ahead and paint in some of the other metallic details that I would like. On the backpack for example, I use Vallejo hammered copper on the trim of the vents and the gauge, as well as the brackets on the pipes. This helps just to break up the silver and gold and add a little bit of detail. Oh, and don't forget her head. Her hair was painted with a coat of GW Rhinox hide. The eyepiece was given a coat of Vallejo dark aluminium. The candle, just like the purity seals, was given a coat of GW Rakarth flesh and the flame Mephiston red, while her face was given a thin coat of pallid witch flesh. Any other details like the skulls or crossbow were also given a thin coat of GW Wraithbone or Rakarth flesh respectively, while the metallic parts of the bolter, the backpack and the grenades were just given a slight touch up with Vallejo dark aluminium. Next up, I'm going to do a little bit of shading on the cloak. So I'm going to start by taking some GW Contrast Flesh Terrors Red and mixing in a little bit of glaze medium in about a 1:1 ratio. Although this is actually to give some shading to the recesses of the cloak's fabric, I'm actually going to begin by giving the whole thing 1 coat to start. Now this takes about 20 minutes to dry, but afterwards I'm able to apply subsequent layers directly into the recesses only. The contrast paint and the glaze medium makes this really easy to apply, and it gets progressively darker with each layer. For the deep recesses directly behind Greyfax, make sure your layers are progressively smaller and towards the centre of the area, so it's going to be darkest right at the deepest point. Unfortunately, a combination of the wet paint and the shine from my lighting setup makes this look the complete opposite on camera. Now, I know I should, but I don't count my layers, and I do prefer to gauge this by eye. But for your reference, I applied roughly around 5 or 6 layers to each recess. If you do overdo it though, don't worry, you can always go over the whole area with a lighter shade and glaze medium to counter the effect. For her tunic, I do the same 1:1 mix of glaze medium and GW Contrast Guilliman Flesh. And then I start to apply this to the recesses. Now, I find this colour really hard to blend and glaze, so this isn't my finest work. Just to be fully honest, this part is more about my attempts of a recovery than an actual technique. What I had attempted to do sounded simple enough. I just wanted to shade it with Guilliman Flesh, and then glaze over those raised areas with GW Wraithbone, but I just could not get it to my liking. I didn't want to start over on another layer of Wraithbone, so I took a break and I carried on with other parts of the model and returned to it at this stage. So I darkened the whole thing down with a burnt sienna oil wash, which I had actually used on the gold parts coming up next. This helped me cover up my poor attempts at blending and try to fix it. I mixed up a thin glaze of GW Wraithbone and started painting towards the raised areas once again. This time I just had to be patient and I took it slow. It's just something that I'm going to have to keep practicing. Now this really isn't going to win any awards. It's a little bit too dark in the shadows, and the transition from light and dark is way too strong in some areas. But I was happy enough with it at this stage, and I was worried that any more paint would just make it worse. There's always a part on every model where sometimes you just have to compromise, so I'm just going to have to learn to live with it. Learning from my mistake, I wanted to keep the rest of the cloak highlights very, very simple. I started by giving the outside of the cloak a thin layer of Vallejo Game Black. This was so that I would have a matching colour if I needed to correct mistakes. I then took some Vallejo Heavy Charcoal, mixed with a little glaze medium, and I only painted thin highlights on the very sharp, raised areas of the cloak towards the backpack. The only other areas to highlight are the bottom of the cloak where it billows upwards, and the corners. Next, still mixing with a little glaze medium, I painted the second highlight of GW Dawnstone, thinner and shorter than the first. And then finally, I give him a highlight of GW Administratum Grey. It's simple and basic, but it's really effective. While this model is small, it does have an awful lot going on, so I think this works really well. Now, as always, I give this a coat of gloss varnish before I move on to the oil washing. For the oil washes, I'm going to mix up two batches. One is a mix of burnt sienna and a little bit of burnt umber. This is the same mix that I use whenever I'm painting gold helmets on my Blood Angels. Now, I've covered this in previous videos, so I'll link them in the video card in the top right. The second is a simple black wash with Winsor & Newton's Lamp Black. So I'm going to start with the black wash, and apply it into all the recesses where the gold trim meets the black metal armour. This not only helps to create some easy shading, but it also helps to cover up any areas where the gold has overspilled. You may need to apply it twice in order to cover up some of those mistakes, so as always, leave it a couple of hours between applications to get the best effect. I apply it quite liberally to areas like the bolter, the corset, the backpack, but otherwise I stick to a normal pin wash. Oh, and don't forget to apply this to the ocular implant on her head. So I left that to dry for about 3 hours before starting the next wash. You can leave it overnight if you prefer, but it's not really necessary. For the gold parts, I started to apply the burnt sienna wash reasonably liberally over the gold areas. I did make sure it settled into the recesses of the shoulder pad and the knees. I didn't want it to pull too much, but if it does, don't worry, it's easy to fix later on with a thin glaze coat of elven gold. At this stage I also took the opportunity to do the purity seal, and the tunic, which I had described earlier on. Now with that done, I've left that to dry for about 12 hours overnight, and then I give it another coat of gloss varnish and move on to highlighting the gold. Going back to my scale 75 elven gold, I thin it down with a little brush full of water, and I start to go over the most raised areas of the gold trim. Now this is a very thin layer of elven gold, it's almost a glaze. I don't want to undo the oil wash, but I do want to remove some areas where the oil paint has settled on the flat or raised areas and maybe pulled a little bit, like this bracer for example. I edge highlight everywhere I can with elven gold, like the raised parts of the skulls and the spikes, but I also do larger flat areas like her thigh, the fronts of her boots and feet, as well as the domed part on her shoulder pad. For the second highlight, I'm going to use Vallejo Metal Gold. Now this is an airbrush paint and it has amazing coverage, but do be careful if you're using it. I need to make sure I've wiped off all the excess paint quite a few times. My brush here looks almost dry, but the paint still flows off really easily. So I'm going to go ahead and edge highlight all the gold areas, including the spikes, and try to carefully catch some of the raised areas like the facial features on the skulls and really make them stand out. The third and final highlight is with GW Stormhost Silver. Thinning with a little bit of water, I tried to put thin edge highlights on the facial features and places like the very tips of the spikes, taking care not to cover up the previous Vallejo Metal Gold. What I'm trying to achieve is a glint effect, a very specific shine to make the armour look like it's caught the light and it's really ornate and shining. It's much brighter than I would normally do gold, but now that I have the recipe, I'm going to have to try this out on a few other test models. I might do a video on an alternate guide for Primaris Sanguinary Guard. What do you think? If you'd be interested in that, let me know in the comments below. Before I move on, I go back in with some scale 75 black metal and touch up some of the raised areas of the black armour. Now this has been thinned down an awful lot and is practically a glaze. That's because I want it to settle in very specific places. So I'm going to apply it to the centre of forward-facing areas of the armour that would catch the light the most. For example, areas like the sides of her thigh, the calves and the chest, as well as other small areas on the shoulder pads and the tips of her boots. Let's move on to Greyfax's face. I started by mixing up several shades of GW Rakarth Flesh and Scale 75 African Shadow, and thinned them down to a glaze consistency. But then I decided to give her face one coat of Rakarth Flesh. I simply realised that Pallid Witch Flesh was just too pale. So, Taking an intermediate shade of Rakarth Flesh and African Shadow, I made sure to wipe off the excess from my brush, and I started to apply it very gently to the areas of her face that would be darker. These would be areas like her cheekbones, around her nose and eyes, the scar on her face, as well as her lips and neck. I just had to take my time and apply the paint in multiple layers and build it up slowly. There's no shortcuts here. It's super easy to overdo it with one brush stroke, so you have to thin down your paint into a glaze whether you like it or not. It's best to work on one area at a time and allow it to dry before returning, but do try to work in a logical order. Now, I'm going to admit I find that really hard to do. I generally like to paint by ordered chaos, but it's just not going to help here, and you really need to make sure that you don't overshade a specific feature. It's really not easy to do in something this small, and it's not easy to film either, but 3 or 4 layers later we have all our features well defined. But she's still a little too pale. So I'm going to go back in with a few coats of GW Reikland Flesh Shade. Now I allowed this to dry in between applications, and it takes about 3 to get her skin to about this stage. She's still pale, but her skin now looks more unhealthy than straight up vampire or zombie. Finally, I wanted to show you how to paint her eye, but it just proved impossible to film. So the only advice I can give you is never paint the eye completely white. Instead, simply paint 2 white dots. Aim for one on the inside and one on the outer part of her eye. This leaves you with an area in between the two that represents the iris. It's very tricky and delicate, but just steady your arms, relax, and go for it. If you do make a mistake, just go back over with some thinned down African Shadow or a thinned layer of Rhinox hide and try again. For her hair, I use the same recipe as I do for Space Marine pouches. So that's a base of GW Rhinox hide, and then a wash of GW Agrax Earthshade. Then I go back over with one highlight of Rhinox hide, and then GW Mournfang Brown. Now I don't consider myself very good at faces, but I am so happy with how this turned out. Next up, I want to add some more detail to the cloak. So I mix equal parts glaze medium with GW Mephiston Red, and I started to apply this to the recessed trim on the back of her cloak. Because of the glaze varnish, this actually comes off my brush quite easily with some capillary action. It doesn't quite flow like an oil wash, but I don't really want it to. If this was any thinner, it might take multiple layers and it may not dry evenly. Now, mistakes here are easily corrected with Vallejo Game Black after you highlight it and before the next varnish layer. This is also a good time to do this for the other Inquisitor symbols on her armour, hat and gloves. So for the first highlight on this trim, I'm going to mix equal parts glaze medium and GW Evil Sun Scarlet, and then highlight the raised areas of the cloak. I'm going to try and paint towards the peak of the highlights to ensure that the paint from my brush settles there. Once dry, I'm going to do the same again, but with a final highlight of GW Wild Rider Red, mixed with a little bit of glaze medium. Oh, and this is the same recipe that I've used for highlighting the edges of the inner part of the cloak. I just kept it to the very edges and used it to cover up any patchy areas where the red meets the black. And lastly, for the candle flame, I did give it just a tiny highlight of Vallejo Orange Fire. Okay, so we're approaching the final stages. I touch up any final mistakes that I've made with Vallejo Game Black, and I give the whole model one more coat of gloss varnish to unify the texture. I think painting in the highlighted red trim really adds a bit more depth and detail to the cloak, and it makes the simple grey highlights that little bit more interesting. For details like the gauge on her backpack, I simply painted that Corax white, added some highlights of red and green for the scale, and then I painted the needle with Vallejo Hammered Copper. Finally, I proceeded to base the model just like I have with the rest of my army, and I'll link the video in the cards above. And the very last thing I do is give her a final coat of Vallejo Polyurethane Satin Varnish to protect the metallic shine. And with that, I'm done! Now I know this is the first miniature I've done in 6 months, but I'm really happy with how this has turned out. I'm particularly proud of the gold trim and the face. In fact, I think the face is the best thing I've managed to paint in a long time. So I hope this video has given you some ideas and tips for painting your own Inquisitor models, or even just for painting gold and pale skin. If it has, please consider leaving a like or subscribing to my channel for more content in the future. So until next time, remember, enjoy your painting, have fun, and I'll see you soon.